Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Salt Talks. My name is John Darcy. I'm the managing director of SALT, which is a global thought leadership forum and networking platform at the intersection of finance, technology, and public policy. SALT Talks are a digital interview series with leading investors, creators, and thinkers. And our goal on these talks is to provide a window into the mind of subject matter experts, as well as provide a platform for what we think are big ideas that are shaping the future. And if you're a frequent listener or watcher of Salt Talks, you know how enthusiastic we are about the blockchain and digital asset space. So we're very excited today to bring you the latest episode of the Salt Crypto Show, which is sponsored by FTX. Our guest today is the president of the Solana Foundation. Her name is Lily Liu. She's also an entrepreneur and investor focused broadly on the cryptocurrency industry. She has a background as a CFO and operating executive in the US, China, and throughout emerging markets, and recently moved to Switzerland. So she's ticked off almost every continent off her resume already, and has a fantastic network as well around the world. She's a co-founder of Anagram, as I mentioned, president of the Solana Foundation, and on the founding team of Osmosis, and an advisor to Brave. Previously, she co-founded Earn.com, which was acquired by Coinbase in 2018. She was also the CFO of the Chinaco Healthcare Corporation, where she built a 500-bed private hospital in China. She also worked at KKR in New York, as well as McKinsey in New York and Beijing. She received a bachelor's degree in economics and international relations from Stanford and studied East Asian studies at Harvard. Lily, amazing resume. I know the Solana Foundation is very proud and excited to have you leading the helm. But in your own words, could you talk to us a little bit about your personal and professional journey and how you ended up working in the cryptocurrency industry after a very decorated career, sort of in various walks of life professionally?
Sure. So I'm from California originally, and I always thought I was going to be a doctor. So actually, when I went to college, I was a pre-med, and I did 80-90% of my pre-med requirements. I think I had like physical chemistry left or something like that. But really what was interesting to me from a young age is, sometimes things happen somewhat serendipitously. And when I was, I think, 9 years old, I was kind of lazing around one summer, played with all the toys, read all the books I was supposed to read. I was like flipping around on the bookshelf, and I read a book called Life and Death in Shanghai, which is a woman's autobiography of essentially being, there's no other way of putting it than being tortured during the Cultural Revolution. So I read this book and it was just insane to me, right? It almost felt like fiction because it was just such an extraordinary kind of story of what one person went through. And I didn't fully understand it. So I read it over and over again. And, I guess it's not really, age appropriate reading for a 9-year-old or anything like that, but it really made an impression upon me. A few years later, my family, which is Chinese, I went to China for the first time as a tourist. And so I'd read this book, Life and Death in Shanghai, landed in the city of Shanghai when they didn't even have Pudong Airport or anything like that in the mid-90s. And I was just astounded, right? Because there was this book that I thought had to be half fiction, except unfortunately it wasn't. And then I was, witnessing basically this 180-degree kind of turnaround from what had happened only a couple of decades earlier. And that was just so fascinating to me, right? And that was like very viscerally interesting to me even as a kid. And that fascination really just stayed with me in all stages of life, even now, right? Because to me, it really just sort of portended some very fundamental questions, but I actually think we're not very good at answering, right? Which is how did part one of that happen? How did the turnaround happen? How does that happen in one generation? And 50 other questions, right? That come from that. And ultimately, I guess when you look in retrospect, some of these things actually do sort of blend together. But some of those things that piqued my interest then, right, and led me to study, in addition to the whole pre-med thing, international relations, economics, East Asian studies, living in China, living around the world. And then ultimately I actually discovered cryptocurrency, Bitcoin at the time, 2013, when I was living in China. What was so fascinating to me about it was sort of this broader interest in how do these economic and political systems form and change and take shape over time, right? Because what Bitcoin basically proposed was, I know in the early days, in the common press, it was oftentimes sort of viewed a little bit in this lens of drug money, money laundering, laundering drug money was maybe some of the, and of course, very speculative, but something a little bit sort of toward in the early days. But when I read the white paper, which is just such the simple sort of 7-8 page type of articulation, mostly in math equations, it was like, okay, this is definitely not a scam, right? And what was more interesting, very tantalizing about it is this idea that you could have an economic system that would be governed by its participants rather than a central power, right? And in that sense, it seemed to get to the whole first principles of the matter of are the governance systems that we presume to be the spectrum of options today actually the full spectrum of options? And why do other options outside of that sort of defined spectrum not exist yet, right? Is that because they cannot work, or is it just because we have not yet enabled them? In crypto, from the very beginning, there's oftentimes been a lot of discussion around what are the use cases that we're going to see in crypto. And that is that's something we're all looking for. It's something that needs to be built. But then at the end of the day, where I think this is all kind of leading towards is this idea that you can have communities that organically form themselves into economies, which to an extent is kind of what's happened with Bitcoin, right? You have these organically formed communities that form into economies, that form into polities, and have a mode of governance, which is still being explored, but looks so fundamentally different from the modes of governance that we see at scale today.
And so as you think about different cryptocurrencies, obviously you're the president of the Solana Foundation. You discovered Bitcoin in 2013 and how it could inform new communities around the world. How do you think about the use cases of each one and how they're different or the same as each other?
Yep. Well, it all started with Bitcoin, 2008, and then up until 2015 when Ethereum came along. For that period of time, it was essentially there's a blockchain where the infrastructure is also kind of the application, which was initially in the early days really focused around payments because that's something where they're kind of implicitly the same, right? There's a blockchain, and what it does is it sends a token from Lily to John and then back again. And it settles on this decentralized network, but fundamentally it's basically that one token, whether it's BTC or XRP or XLM. Those are some of the earlier products as well, projects, Ripple and Stellar, where you basically send that token from point A to point B and back again. And so now in retrospect, there's kind of this now, I think broadly and probably, pretty permanent narrative around Bitcoin as digital gold. In the early days, I don't think that was the settled position, actually. In the early days, there was a lot of conversation around Bitcoin as being a scalable global payments network. So no one really talks about that anymore, but this was hotly debated in sort of like prior to the whole scaling debate, which also took a year and a half to resolve, 2016 to 2017 as a separate matter. But that was essentially sort of phase one where infrastructure equaled application, right? What the common thread was this idea that you could basically transmit value with an API call, right? That was very tantalizing to, I think, the earliest engineers that were working in this space. And that was, even now is something that is, extremely sort of compelling to many developers who start to really understand that about crypto. But then when Ethereum launched in 2015, that was the first articulation at scale of this is not just decentralized infrastructure to send its native token between Lily and John and back, although you can do that as well. But really, this is decentralized infrastructure which can support smart applications, smart contracts, and essentially sort of fuller fledged applications to be run on this decentralized infrastructure. So essentially, you can do an almost unlimited number of things outside of just sending a native token between, from me to you and back again. And so that was, I think, the next major thing that happened. It's infrastructure for applications, not just payments. And that's where people started to, the ERC20 standard came along so that if I wanted to, I could mint Lilycoin, right? Or you could mint USDC, a lot more valuable than Lilycoin, and thousands, if not tens of thousands of other things. And that really opened up the space for, wow, there's like these tokens. I think people might have different ways of characterizing it, but they're a full spectrum of, really innovative activity, and then also people doing things that, let's just call it short-term interest, right? But either way, open up this entire space and then introduce this idea of decentralized applications. Now, in 2017 and 2018, you had the whole ICO boom, and then you also had the first glimmer of NFTs being the seeds of communities with CryptoKitties and that sort of massive torrent of interest, and also crashing the network, CryptoKitties. And with all of that activity that flooded onto Ethereum, then it became very apparent that there were some scalability issues. And scalability in 2017, 2018, I think most people sort of saw scalability really most immediately in transactions per second, or TPS, just throughput, right? I think today people think about scalability in additional ways. But the simplest way to think about scalability is like, how many transactions can you do per second? And so there was this whole generation of blockchains where people were innovating on how do you scale, right? Do you build a rollup? Do you build a layer 2? And the philosophy, I think, originally of Ethereum was always that there would be L2 or side chains, or basically ways to scale transaction processing off of the main chain of Ethereum. And that was kind of the presumed requirement, I think, for a number of folks looking at the space. Some people called it shorting, L2s, rollups, various things that people called it. But then Solana came along, and totally is basically like, well, what if you just put everything on one chain? Oh my God, you can't do that, right? And so, but totally, I think because he came from a network infrastructure background, having worked at Qualcomm previously, had in somewhat similar ways, or at least translatable ways, dealt with this idea that you had to have sort of very decentralized network that could process like an incredible sort of load of information and signal, right? And various ways of handling that and providing capacity for that. Anyway, so they basically came up with a number of innovations. There's quite a number of them, but one of them is this idea of proof of history. So in order to increase the parallelization of processing of sort of information and transactions on the network, you could synchronize different nodes by basically creating like a machine clock, right? And a timekeeper using computer hashes. And that way you can more or less sync up totally independent computers or network nodes or servers that are all performing that, are entering or leaving the network at will. And you can still sort of, keep the network in sync while also sort of introducing some parallel capacity, right? So that, amongst many other things, enabled Solana to essentially have this like massively sort of more performant infrastructure. In the kind of that category of this is infrastructure for decentralized applications, right? And there are a lot of people in the 2017, 2018 era that started to do something similar with slightly different architectures and trade-offs. And then, so fast forward for a while, took a while to build that. It's pretty complex. Solana launched their mainnet in March of 2020, I think right around when the pandemic really hit the US as well. So interesting time to launch something when the world is shutting down. And I think that Solana basically really sort of articulated and demonstrated how useful this could be when Serum got built on Solana, enabling central limit order books to actually exist on chain. And so, if you've been following crypto over the last couple of years, the first application space that really blew up recently was actually in the summer of 2020, when decentralized finance really took off and really took off initially on Ethereum, but took off in a way that, because you don't have the performance on Ethereum to support central limit order books, right? If a transaction costs a couple of dollars and can take up to minutes to clear, you just can't support that many clicks of a button, right? So you can't post a bid and cancel a bid, and it just doesn't work, right? So initially, a lot of decentralized finance was built around protocol constructions that did not require extremely sort of high frequency of turnover and extremely fast transaction processing. So something like an automated market maker tolerates very well sort of low latency, right? So all of the kind of DeFi primitives that were built were basically built around a chain that costs a couple of dollars and takes a couple of minutes. And then once Solana came along and basically was so performant that it kind of felt like Web 2, and then you click a button and something happens immediately, right? And we're so accustomed to that these days because, that's what we get in the regular internet, that just things just are instant and very performant. So Solana basically launched central limit order book trading the beginning of 2021. And that was it really just leveled up the entire DeFi space, right? Because it allows you to do entirely different things once you have that type of responsiveness. So anyways, I don't know, it doesn't have to be like a history lesson in Solana or anything like that.
I think it's valuable. I think people who are less schooled on the history of Solana and sort of the layer one sweepstakes that takes place, understanding the trade-offs of different chains. And one thing that has always struck me about Solana, I think the technology underlying the chain, obviously extremely powerful, one of the fastest blockchains that allows for the type of scale that you were talking about. But I think the ability to build community is also something that stands out in the Solana ecosystem. Could you talk a little bit about what Solana's approach is to building community, to stoking developer activity, and how that has differentiated it from other chains as well?
Totally. This is this is actually my favorite thing to talk about. And one of the things that I oversee at the foundation is we call it new markets growth, but it's really new markets is basically ex-US. I joke that, but I actually do mean it. From Solana's perspective, Germany is a new market, right? People don't think about Germany as a new market in any sense in the conventional sort of mindset. But to us, new markets is anywhere where there's a substantial amount of awareness around blockchain and Solana yet to be built, right? And so the first thing that I think a lot about is that blockchains, they're not companies. There's no product, there's no service, there's no cap table, right? Because the entire sort of way that the entire incentive structure that underpins the corporate world does not apply to cryptocurrency, right? That being, there's capital invested, taking a risk on the development of some product or service that is then produced and sold for revenue, has some cost of being provided. You've got margin, profit, that then the flywheel is that rolls back into the people who took some risks to begin with, right? Whether capital risk, human capital risk, or labor capital, or financial capital risk in order to develop that product or service. And that is that underpins the business world, right? That underpins the way we think about finance, that underpins the way we think about capital markets, that underpins the way we think about money and value creation. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, right? It just doesn't really port over actually that well to this world of L1s, because an L1 is not a company, right? Solana is an open protocol and it has no real product actually. There's no product, there's no service. There's no cap table. There's no cost of goods sold, right? There's no profit. There's just a token. And then anyone who would like to join the network can do so and find ways to mutually create value within that ecosystem, right? So node operators, they are only going to operate within Solana if it makes sense for them. And by makes sense, I mean, before anything else, financially makes sense for them. And so we really think about Solana and L1s, generally speaking, as actually being communities. And once they reach a certain scale, then they actually become economies. And then once there's enough value there of mutual concern, then they start to adopt governance. And maybe it sounds insane to say, but to me that it really is on the pathway to becoming city, country, civilization, right? This is like what these L1s are platforms for. So when we think about building community, therefore it inherently is like you have to think about that differently from building a company, right? So in a company, you build a brand for a product. In a community, you've also got to sort of build, I wouldn't exactly call it a brand, right? But you've got to build like a common set of interests and values to bind that community together. And then you also have to sort of inspire people to feel like they actually own that community. They own a part of that community in their own way. And that's not just owning the token. It's not just financial, but actually what it's more about than anything else is hearts and minds, right? And a sense of belonging. And so what's so funny about it is these L1s, they're so explicitly commercial and financial in one sense. And yet in the other, they are highly emotional and highly based on people just wanting to be a part of it. And so in terms of building a sustainable sort of growth model for something like an L1, ironically, in my opinion, it actually hinges much more on inspiring people to go build that community rather than, having a long list of corporate partnerships, right? So when we think about building community, being cool really matters, right? And I think part of that is because, well, first of all, everyone likes to be part of a cool community. But then also, if you think about it very pragmatically, the way an L1 gets built is, in my opinion, there's kind of 4 funnels that matter. The first one is the network funnel, by which I mean you build the software and then you've got to get node operators to actually run the network. Otherwise, there's no network, there's no blockchain, there's nothing to do, right? Nothing exists. Okay, so that's the first funnel, and that takes typically 2-3 years to get to mainnet. Now, once you have a network, if you don't have any developers building any applications, well, you're not going to be Bitcoin again, right? Because there's a slot of 1 for Bitcoin digital gold, right? Okay, we know who that is. That's Bitcoin. All right. So now everyone's competing for infrastructure for decentralized applications. All right. So you need as many people as possible to be building amazing applications, right? Otherwise, there's nothing for anyone else to do. And so the second funnel that matters, and this is the most important funnel right now for the entire industry, for Solana included, for absolutely every project in this space, is the developer funnel. And so if there's, let's say, 40 million developers in the world, and I think Electric Capital has put out a report saying there's maybe 17, 18,000, let's just call it 20, round up, 20,000 developers that are are building in Web3 in some capacity, right? Then how do you attract more and more developers to be building within Web3, right? Not just smart contracts, but then also developer tooling above and below that, so on and so forth. Okay, so because with developers, they've got to be innovating, building cool stuff. Otherwise, like there's no point in thinking about users, right? Because what are they going to use? And then the third funnel, I feel like, which matters more for entertainment and the kind of media-oriented application verticals, such as gaming and NFTs. The third one is really around creators, right? But the creators have required developers to support sort of their creative work as well. Because, if you've got an NFT, you want to put it on a marketplace, some developers got to go build that marketplace first. And then once all of that is in place, then can you really sort of have a sustainable conversation around users, right? So from my perspective, where we are in 2022 within the industry is I actually think it's premature to talk about users. I think it's never an irrelevant metric, but I think it's more of a vanity metric than a sort of very useful metric right now, because I just don't think there are enough really compelling applications out there for people to have a reason to be using decentralized applications even more than like 30 minutes a day at best, right? Even that's a little bit of a stretch. And that probably only applies to your most dedicated DeFi traders. And so I think that it's really just about developers. There's, once a network is running, there's always more things you can do. That's sort of like funnel 1. And then funnel 2 is all about the developers, Because the thing is, the applications that are going to really matter in Web3 that are really going to sort of be that those applications are bringing a billion people into crypto. I don't think they really exist yet. And I don't think they're going to be a skeuomorphic sort of port over of what happens in how we use Web 2 currently, right? It can't be, because it never is. And also, by definition, if we think this is really revolutionary technology, it always is revolutionary because it opens up essentially new parts of existing markets, right? It exposes sort of long tails of existing markets and allows you to organize those. That's the way it's always been. And so I think we're still absolutely searching for those application spaces. I think a number of them still need new infrastructure to be built. So in the same way that central limit order books were not possible in 2018, but they are now on chain because there was a lot of innovation that happened in between, right? Solana happened, Serum happened, a bunch of other things happened to enable that. I think there's like a whole other sort of set of innovation which is going to be required, which all requires developer talent. So anyway, so that's, in my opinion, why it's really just about attracting and supporting developers in the ecosystem. And if that's the case, then okay, why should a developer basically drop what they're doing and come into Web3 and take kind of a massive risk, right? So not only do L1s have no product or service, right? They're asking someone else to actually be creating a bunch of value on this platform. And so it's like a total inversion of how companies work, right? And so therefore, when it comes to building community, a big part of what attracts people into a community is that sense of belonging and shared value and coolness and kind of like being part of the movement, being part of a generation. And there's like various aspects, I feel like, of the inspiration and the aspirational nature of what it means to be a part of any community, right? And so that's something that has that I think Solana has done a really amazing job at, right? I think in terms of like the visual design of Solana, I think itself is cool. It's like a very sort of positive community that amid all these kind of, I guess, the gladiatorial sort of desire to pit L1 here against another L1 or something. I think Solana has always kind of taken the high road with a lot of those things. So I think, so that's how I guess I've thought a little bit about community. But I think what we're trying to really figure out now is, all right, we've got a number of these communities which exist, and we started to create a little bit of organization around communities. We call those DAOs, I suppose. Although, let's be honest, today DAOs are mostly just a Notion and a Discord, right, and a Twitter account, right? And maybe a token, whether fungible or non-fungible. So how much of this is actually really Web3 native? I would say it's aspirationally Web3 native rather than actually Web3 native, right? A lot of the tooling behind what these DAOs are. But what is unmistakable about them is that people have sort of gravitated and self-opted into communities that speak to them in one way or another. Okay, so then how do you take those like sort of very organic sources of energy and actually turn those into even more valuable communities, meaning economies, and then beyond that, right? That's organic growth, right, in like the most visceral way. And then Solana, the protocol, right, and the community, those are ways to really support those communities. So to me, it's just we're obviously still thinking about it. I think this entire industry is still trying to think about exactly how this works. That's the fun part to me, that it's not very often that you get to kind of think about entirely new business models, right? They're not even business models, because there's no business really to be done here in terms of here's a product and service and I'm going to sell it and make some money on it. Really, it's like the entire like mindset in a sense is like does not even apply here, right? So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but those are some of our thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, like you said, it's not a new business model. It's a way of restructuring the entire financial system and incentive structure within that system. And it's fascinating to see it play out, and new use cases pop up every day for blockchain, tokenization, things of that nature. You touched on Ethereum earlier. Ethereum is sort of that great vintage car that maybe they've tried to restore it recently with the merge, with the transition to proof of stake. But as you mentioned, there's still certain limitations around speed and throughput and things of that nature that prevent it from scaling organically. And you have several layer 2 solutions that have popped up that have gotten funding and have some promise, but still doesn't have that native scalability. Could you talk about how the merge and the transition of proof of stake, how you see that affecting Ethereum, the trade-offs there, and how Solana still sort of separates itself from Ethereum in terms of use cases?
Yeah. I have a lot of respect and a lot of love for Ethereum. I think they've continue to accomplish something really amazing and have an incredible community, right? I've never really seen this as, one is going to live and the other is going to die, right? And I think like once you remove yourself from, that being an expected outcome or something, then at least for me, it kind of changes my mindset about how to think about Ethereum and also how to think about Solana. Ethereum is going to be successful. They already are wildly successful. But then I do think that there are trade-offs with having this kind of having a sort of more L2 driven scalability model versus having things sort of first and foremost co-located and still performant on a single chain, right? I think that with Solana, I actually think, going back to basics in basic use cases, payments is an incredibly powerful use case that I think crypto sort of stopped talking about and stopped really pursuing because, frankly, payments never really worked in crypto, right? No one really ever wanted to use Bitcoin for payments because it took an hour, and transaction fees have been anywhere between expensive to completely unworkable, right? I remember at one point I once paid $50 for a single Bitcoin transaction in 2018 or something like that, right? So as it turns out, the original use case of crypto and one of the most basic use cases of crypto has been really bad at this entire time. And to me, there's two things that really kind of had to happen in order for us to even be able to reconsider payments as a use case. One is that there had to be a sufficiently trusted and liquid stablecoin or stable coins. So there had to be sort of scale collateralized stable coins, right? Maybe it'll change in the future, but I would say in 2022, the stable coins that people are willing to use and trust and truly think that are marked one-to-one are collateralized stable coins. And more specifically, collateralized USD stable coins. And so, even back in 2018, we didn't really have that. And now we've got USDT, we've got USDC, we've got a couple of others. So there's enough liquidity in the stablecoin market that there's actually something that is, doesn't have the volatility concerns, which can kill a lot of payments use cases. So that's in place. And then the other is that we have a network like Solana, which is a fraction of a second and a fraction of a cent to send a transaction. And therefore, you can start to approximate the experience that you get if you're using Venmo. It's even better, I would say, than using PayPal or something like that. And then add on top of that you have smart contracting and the ability to build decentralized applications that can add, I don't want to put intelligence, but more functionality to how you would want to interact with money. And there's this whole world of possibility that literally didn't exist until, maybe a year ago, right? And I would say that that's pretty unique from something like an Ethereum, because even Ethereum post-merge, they've got the liquidity of, let's say, a USDC, and they have liquidity on the main chain. But the thing is that, the way bridging works today and the way multi-chain kind of interactions work today is within the broader Ethereum ecosystem, the only stable coins that people really kind of care about are the ones that are on ETH mainnet, because that's where the liquidity is, right? Like an Arbitrum USDC is not the same liquidity pool as like a ETH, as an ERC20 USDC. And so in my mind, it doesn't really count as USDC because it's not the same thing, right? So in that sense, I think and even post-merge, right, ETH is much cheaper and it's a little bit faster, but it's still, orders of magnitude away from a fraction of a cent or a fraction of a second. And so I think that is, payments is the oldie but goodie, I would say, in terms of use cases that we just kind of stopped talking about because crypto was supposed to be good at it, but it was actually really bad at it up until now, I would say. So I think that's one example of something that I think Solana can really excel at. And then if you build upon that, well, if this is actually sort of a very scalable payment rail, and DeFi is something which exists, is kind of the most scale application vertical right now as well, then that becomes, to me, really interesting from like a financial innovation perspective.
Could you talk a little bit about, Solana continues to iterate. As you mentioned, the chain only launched in 2020. It's hard to even fathom that given the scale of the growth from that time, given that a lot of the dominant blockchains in the space are much older than that. But Solana has struggled with outages. Historically, there was a long period in recent months of no outages, and recently there was another outage. Could you talk about that continued iterative process on Solana to prevent outages and just generally iterate around the blockchain and how to make it better?
Sure. So Solana has been on mainnet now for, I guess, 2.5 years. So if you were to line its like sort of lifespan up with where Ethereum was, it would be equivalent to sort of end of 2017, 2018 for Ethereum. Of course, it's not exactly one-to-one, but then in the early days of Ethereum, there were also a number of outages, not to mention the whole DAO situation and the forking of ETH as well. So in the early days of many of these networks, there's been volatility, tumult, technical roadmaps whose the demand for which outpaced its ability to execute. This has happened with so many networks in the blockchain space and also really in the Web2 space as well. In the early 2000s, I probably wasn't paying attention as much, but I understand AWS also had some scaling challenges in the early days because they were also probably, had more demand for that infrastructure than they were able to scale like at any given moment, right? So I think that's also been the case for Solana, where 2020 was sort of finding these use cases that would really differentiate Solana and really showcase what it's able to do. And then 2021 was, especially after the NFT kind of thing came in July, it was just like this massive increase in demand for the network. And you can't really sort of plan a roadmap for that. Like, it's going to be 100x demand. So what are we going to do to accommodate that? So I think Solana has been a victim of its own success in many of those ways. It really does remind me of the early days of Ethereum. So there's no question it's been a challenge. And there's no question that the uptime should be 100, like 100.00, right? But then there's a number of things that Solana is doing to address that from both the software and a hardware perspective. And so on the software side, there's been a number of software upgrades. One of them is, and by software upgrade, sometimes that sounds like, that sounds a little bit like the software update that comes on your computer and you click a button and you're like, hey, okay, right? Like these are not just software upgrades. Like these are like software re-implementations. Actually, they're like pretty substantial things to be able to implement. So one is fee markets. That's not just an upgrade. That's like a lot of kind of engineering that has to go in to implement a fee market. There's been upgraded transport protocol and the implementation of Quick, right? There's also stake weighted voting. And these are all, to say that they're like features or upgrades kind of may actually make them sound more sort of trivial than they actually are in terms of like what needs to be engineered and implemented. So there's that. And then also we have a partnership with Jump, where Jump's software team is also building a second software client for the Solana protocol. And so that's pretty significant, right? Because one of it essentially means that if the current client were to just, for whatever reason, completely disappear overnight, right, the network could still fully function with there being another client on the market. Totally independently built. And that is one of the best things to be done in terms of sort of decentralizing and diversifying her participation in the network. So there's that. And then also, the validators, Solana has always taken a perspective that Solana does use, there's still CPUs, but uses like some of the most high-end CPU specs out there. And so it's one of the highest specs of any proof of stake network. And so given the higher sort of hardware specification, there's been a sort of, I guess there's been a decision that like that sort of trade-off of requiring a higher spec node is worth it for the performance that you get, right? And that as a side note, I would say that sometimes that articulation of trade-offs, like people are very familiar with the kind of first order trilemma of blockchain architecture trade-offs, right? Speed, security, decentralization. But then what people talk about a little bit less is the trade-off between, okay, if you have a slower network, what is the trade-off that means for actually users? Like what are the trade-offs of some of these designs for other participants and other sort of stakeholders in your sort of broader blockchain ecosystem as well? And so, I think if you take a little bit of that broader view of trade-offs, right, you trade off a little bit in terms of the accessibility of the hardware. But then what you get in return is you are more able to provide a very good experience for users because you click the button, just works. Anyways, so on the hardware side, it is a higher spec. And so what that means is, are there over the medium term also hardware optimizations that can be made if you do a custom validator in order to sort of further improve throughput, performance, so on and so forth of the network.
Well, Lily, it's been a pleasure to have you on Salt Talks and the Salt Crypto Show. We're big believers in what you guys are building at Solana. In addition to my role at Salt, I'm a partner at Skybridge, and we have money where our mouth is and skin in the game with Solana and Serum, and are very enthusiastic about your future and are excited to have someone with your experience and pedigree at the helm of the foundation. So thanks for joining us here on Salt Talks. Look forward to different areas of collaboration between Salt, Skybridge, and Solana going forward. And I'll hope to see you soon in person.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, John.
Thanks again, Lily. And thanks everybody for tuning in to today's Salt Talk with Lily Liu, who's the president of the Solana Foundation. Just a reminder, if you missed any part of this episode or any of our previous Salt Talks, you can access them on our website at salt.org/talks, or on our YouTube channel, which is called SaltTube, or anywhere that you consume podcasts. This is available in audio form. Also, we're on social media. Twitter is where we're most active at Salt Conference, but we're also on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook as well. And please spread the word about these Salt Talks. Again, Solana is only 2 and change years old. It's a young blockchain that has exploded in terms of its use cases and community, and we certainly encourage you to be a part of that community. But on behalf of the entire Salt team, this is John Darcy signing off for today. We hope to see you back here again soon.